The bodycam footage begins before anyone fully understands what they are looking at. A patrol officer stands outside a suburban home in Windsor, Wisconsin. The atmosphere is quiet, almost routine. Missing persons calls are common. Families worry. Adults disappear for a few hours and return. At first, nothing about the scene appears extraordinary. But over the next several days, investigators begin noticing something difficult to ignore. The story keeps changing. The person telling that story is Chandler Halderson. At the center of the investigation are his parents, Bart and Krista Halderson. According to Chandler, they had suddenly left town for a family cabin trip. He explains this calmly, casually. His tone never fully matches the seriousness of the situation. That contrast becomes one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. When officers ask where his parents went, Chandler gives details. Specific roads. A location near the Wisconsin River. Plans involving friends and property owners. He speaks with confidence, but confidence is not the same as consistency. Because almost immediately, investigators begin finding problems. The people Chandler claims his parents were visiting say they never planned a trip. Phone records begin raising questions. Surveillance footage does not align with the timeline he describes. And while Chandler continues speaking calmly, the evidence slowly starts moving in another direction. At this point, the bodycam footage becomes important. Not because it contains a confession, but because it captures behavior in real time. Officers observe Chandler interacting naturally. Laughing occasionally. Making conversation. Offering explanations quickly when questions arise. To investigators, this matters. Not because grief has one correct appearance, but because Chandler seems unusually prepared with answers. One of the first major cracks appears when detectives examine Chandler's background more closely. For months, he had been telling friends and family that he was about to begin a job at SpaceX. He described the hiring process in detail. He talked about relocating. About opportunities. About his future. There was only one problem. None of it was true. Investigators discovered Chandler was not employed by SpaceX. In fact, records suggest he had not even completed the educational requirements he claimed to have finished. The lies extended further than officers initially realized. He had fabricated school enrollment. Fabricated internships. Fabricated professional contacts. This discovery changes the tone of the investigation. Now detectives are no longer evaluating a worried son trying to help locate his parents. They are evaluating someone who has demonstrated a sustained ability to construct false realities and maintain them over long periods of time. As pressure increases, Chandler's explanations become more complicated. He claims his parents left without their phones because they wanted privacy. He explains away inconsistencies by suggesting poor reception near the cabin area. But modern investigations do not rely solely on statements. They rely on digital movement. GPS data. Financial activity. Surveillance systems. Vehicle tracking. And slowly, investigators begin building a timeline that does not support Chandler's version of events. One of the most important moments in the case arrives quietly. A farmer discovers human remains in a rural area. The discovery immediately escalates the investigation. Forensic teams respond. Detectives begin connecting evidence to the Halderson family. And although authorities are careful about public statements, internally the case is shifting from a missing persons investigation into a homicide investigation. The emotional weight of the story changes here. Until this moment, uncertainty still existed. Families disappear sometimes. Strange circumstances can have innocent explanations. But human remains eliminate many possibilities. From this point forward, investigators are no longer trying to determine whether something happened. They are trying to determine who is responsible. And Chandler continues talking. This is one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the case. Even as evidence grows around him, his demeanor remains controlled. He does not appear panicked. He does not dramatically collapse under questioning. Instead, his responses adapt gradually. Small revisions, slight changes, additional explanations layered on top of previous ones. Experienced investigators often watch for this pattern. Truth usually becomes simpler over time. Lies tend to become more complex. As detectives continue interviewing Chandler, body language experts and online viewers later point to subtle details. The speed of certain answers, the pauses before others, the tendency to over-explain small issues while remaining vague about critical events. None of these things alone prove guilt. But collectively, they create tension. And that tension grows stronger as digital evidence continues arriving. Search histories, phone locations, deleted communications, video surveillance. Modern homicide investigations increasingly rely on invisible evidence trails. A person can lie verbally, but electronic systems often record behavior independently. This becomes one of the defining realities of modern true crime cases. Technology quietly documents daily life in ways many people underestimate. Investigators discovered Chandler had been maintaining multiple narratives simultaneously. Friends believed one version of his life. Family believed another. Online contacts sometimes heard something entirely different. Maintaining these stories required constant adjustment, constant improvisation. And eventually, improvisation becomes difficult when confronted with physical evidence. As forensic analysis continues, investigators begin reconstructing what they believe happened inside the Halderson home. Publicly released information later reveals disturbing details involving dismemberment and disposal of remains. These details shocked the community not only because of their brutality, but because they contrasted so sharply with Chandler's outward presentation. He did not fit the stereotype many people expect. This becomes another important lesson in cases like this. Dangerous behavior does not always present dramatically. Sometimes it appears ordinary, calm, friendly, even helpful. The interrogation footage reflects this dynamic perfectly. Detectives question Chandler carefully. At times they allow silence to build naturally. At other moments they introduce evidence strategically, watching how he responds. Unlike highly confrontational interrogations, this process unfolds gradually. Investigators do not rush. They let contradictions accumulate. This technique can be extremely effective. When suspects are confronted too aggressively too early, they often retreat emotionally and stop cooperating. But when investigators reveal inconsistencies slowly, the pressure becomes psychological rather than theatrical. And Chandler begins encountering a problem common in deception-based cases. Memory. Truthful memories usually remain stable because they are rooted in real experience. Fabricated stories must be actively maintained. Every invented detail creates another detail that must later remain consistent. Over time, this becomes exhausting. Investigators begin revisiting earlier statements with Chandler. Dates, locations, conversations, timelines. Certain explanations no longer align with newly obtained evidence. When confronted, Chandler adjusts again. To outside viewers, the process can appear subtle. But experienced detectives understand what they are watching. The story is bending under pressure. Meanwhile, bodycam footage from search operations adds another layer to the case. Officers move through wooded areas. Evidence teams photograph scenes carefully. Search warrants expand. Each new discovery narrows the range of innocent explanations. Public interest grows rapidly. Online communities begin analyzing footage frame by frame. News coverage intensifies. Court filings become public. And eventually, the investigation produces enough evidence for prosecutors to formally charge Chandler Halderson with the murders of his parents. But even then, the case continues evolving. Because trials are not simply about accusations. They are about narratives competing against evidence. During court proceedings, prosecutors present a reconstruction of events built from forensic findings, digital data, surveillance footage, and Chandler's own statements. One of the prosecution's strongest advantages is inconsistency. Jurors do not need to understand every forensic detail perfectly if they repeatedly observe a defendant changing explanations whenever evidence appears. This becomes one of the most powerful aspects of the prosecution's case. The lies are not isolated. They form a pattern. And patterns are persuasive. Witness testimony further damages Chandler's credibility. Friends describe years of deception involving education, employment, and future plans. Family members recount concerns and inconsistencies. Digital records contradict verbal claims repeatedly. Piece by piece, prosecutors build an argument that Chandler was not merely lying occasionally. He was constructing identities. This psychological element fascinates many viewers because it raises uncomfortable questions. How much deception can exist beneath ordinary interactions? How long can someone maintain parallel versions of reality before collapse becomes inevitable? The courtroom footage captures this tension constantly. Unlike emotional outbursts seen in some trials, much of this case unfolds with restraint. Jurors listen quietly. Attorneys move carefully through timelines and evidence. Chandler remains relatively composed. But composure cannot erase contradiction. And contradiction becomes overwhelming. The prosecution argues that financial pressure and exposure risk may have contributed to motive. Chandler's fabricated life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Expectations from family were rising. Questions about employment and education were becoming harder to avoid. Again, motive alone does not prove guilt. But motive combined with deception, forensic evidence, inconsistent statements, and digital tracking creates a much larger picture. One of the most chilling aspects of the case is how normal many moments appear before context changes them completely. Ordinary conversations. Casual behavior. Daily routines. Bodycam footage of seemingly routine interactions later becomes evidence viewed through an entirely different lens. This transformation is part of what makes modern true crime so compelling to audiences. People are not only watching crimes unfold. They are watching perception change. At the beginning of the investigation, Chandler appears cooperative, informative, concerned. But as evidence accumulates, viewers begin reinterpreting earlier footage. Statements that once sounded ordinary begin sounding calculated. Calmness begins feeling unnatural. Confidence begins looking rehearsed. Whether these interpretations are fully accurate or influenced by hindsight is always important to consider. True crime audiences often analyze behavior after outcomes are already known. That can distort perception. Still, the psychological progression remains powerful. The Chandler Halderson case is ultimately not remembered for one dramatic confession or one explosive moment. It is remembered for gradual collapse. For investigators patiently allowing evidence to dismantle a constructed reality piece by piece. The bodycam footage matters because it captures the beginning of that collapse before anyone fully understands where the story is heading. The interrogation footage matters because it documents how contradictions evolve under pressure. And the digital evidence matters because it reflects a modern truth about criminal investigations. Very little stays invisible forever. Phones record movement. Search engines preserve curiosity. Security cameras capture timelines. Vehicles generate data. Electronic systems silently observe daily behavior in ways previous generations never experienced. This case demonstrates how difficult it has become to sustain false narratives against layered digital evidence. Even highly detailed lies can struggle to survive when surrounded by independent verification systems. And yet, despite all the technology, one of the most important elements remains human behavior. Investigators noticed inconsistencies before many major forensic discoveries occurred. They recognized tension between presentation and circumstance. They understood that stories requiring constant revision often signal deeper problems. That instinct guided the investigation forward until physical evidence confirmed their suspicions. By the end of the trial, prosecutors argued they had demonstrated not only homicide, but extensive efforts to conceal it. The jury ultimately agreed. Chandler Halderson was convicted. But long after verdicts are delivered, cases like this continue attracting attention because they feel psychologically unfinished. Viewers continue asking the same question. What was happening internally during those interviews? Was Chandler convinced he could maintain control? Did he believe the story would survive? Or was the calmness itself part of the performance? Those questions may never be fully answered. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of why the footage remains so compelling. Because unlike fictional crime stories, real investigations do not unfold with dramatic music or perfect clarity. They unfold slowly. Through paperwork, interviews, timelines, contradictions, searches, quiet observations. The truth emerges gradually. And in this case, every new piece of evidence weakened the story further. Until eventually, the story could no longer hold together at all.